The modern world is not just a place of sound, it is an industrial complex of noise designed to keep your mind in a state of constant vibration. Every notification, every advertisement, and every desperate shout for attention is a brick in the wall of a prison we have built for ourselves. We are taught from birth that to be quiet is to be forgotten, and to be silent is to be weak. We live in a society that rewards the loudest voice, even if it has nothing to say. This is the story of Julian, a man who once sat at the very center of that noise, convinced that his ability to outshout the world was his greatest asset. Julian was a high-stakes corporate liquidator in the heart of Manhattan. His life was measured in decibels. He spoke through 3 phones at once, barked orders at subordinates, and believed that the more words he used, the more territory he conquered. He walked through the glass corridors of power with a voice that echoed like a hammer, crushing opposition and demanding absolute obedience. To Julian, silence was a void, a terrifying space that invited failure. He filled every second of his day with his own voice, convinced that if he stopped talking, his empire would crumble. He was a man addicted to the sound of his own authority, oblivious to the fact that his internal world was becoming a hollow echo chamber. But the universe has a way of silencing those who refuse to listen. In a single, catastrophic week, the noise Julian had built his life upon turned into a deafening scream. His firm collapsed under the weight of a betrayal he was too loud to hear coming. His partners, whom he had intimidated for years, vanished overnight. His wealth, once a mountain of gold, melted like wax. Suddenly, the phone stopped ringing. The assistant stopped running. The boardroom, once filled with the thunder of his commands, became a tomb of cold air. Julian stood in the middle of his empty penthouse, his mouth open as if to shout, but no sound came out. The silence he had feared his entire life had finally arrived, and it was heavier than any loss he could have imagined. He spent days in that silence, paralyzed. Without the noise to define him, Julian felt like a ghost. He realized that for decades, he hadn't been a powerful man, he had been a loud man. There is a profound difference between the two. Power is a presence, but loudness is a performance. As he stared at the skyline of a city that had already forgotten his name, Julian felt the crushing weight of his own insignificance. He was a king of nothing, a master of static. It was in this absolute darkness of spirit that he remembered an old legend his grandfather once told him, a story about a monastery hidden in the brutal isolation of the northern tundra, where the monks practiced a form of silence so deep it was said to alter reality itself. With nothing left to lose, Julian gathered what remained of his pride and walked away from the noise forever. The journey to the monastery of the frozen breath was not a journey of miles, but a journey of shedding. As Julian traveled further from civilization, the layers of his old identity began to peel away like dead skin. The constant mental chatter, the internal arguments, the plans for revenge, the echoes of past insults, began to feel like physical weights. By the time he reached the gates of the stone fortress nestled between 2 jagged peaks, he was exhausted, not from the climb, but from the noise inside his own head. He expected a grand reception, a philosophical debate, or at least a set of rules. Instead, a monk met him at the gate, pointed to a wooden bowl of water, and motioned for him to follow. No words were exchanged. Not then, not the next day, not for the first month. The first few weeks were a descent into madness. Without the ability to speak, Julian's ego began to starve. He wanted to explain who he was, to tell the monks about his former glory, to complain about the cold or the bland food. But there was no one to listen. The monks moved like shadows, their faces masks of calm indifference. Julian found himself screaming internally, his mind generating a storm of thoughts to compensate for the lack of external sound. He realized that most human conversation is just a way to avoid the terrifying reality of our own minds. We talk to drown out the truth. We talk to convince ourselves we exist. In the silence of the monastery, Julian was forced to confront the monster he had become, a man who used words as a shield because he was too afraid to be seen as he truly was. He was assigned the task of clearing snow from the central courtyard. Every morning, for 6 hours, he shoveled in absolute stillness. At first, he did it with anger, his mind cursing the monks and the cold. But slowly, the rhythm of the work began to change him. He started to hear the subtle differences in the sound of the wind. He noticed the way the ice formed intricate patterns on the stones. He began to see the world not as a resource to be exploited, but as a masterpiece to be observed. One afternoon, while sitting on a stone bench, he felt a sudden shift. The internal storm simply stopped. For a few seconds, there was no thought, no judgment, no ego. There was only the breath, the cold air, and the vast, ancient mountain. In that moment, Julian realized that he hadn't been silenced, he had been opened. He understood that silence wasn't a punishment, it was the ultimate freedom from the tyranny of the self. He began to study the monks, not through their words, but through their presence. He noticed that when they moved, they didn't waste an ounce of energy. Their silence wasn't empty, it was full of observation. They were constantly listening, not just to sounds, but to the energy of the room, the shift in the weather, and the unspoken needs of their brothers. Julian realized that his old life was a series of missed opportunities because he was too busy talking to listen. He had missed the nuances of his deals, the true feelings of his family, and the warnings of his own intuition. He began to practice the listening of the soul. He learned to hold his tongue even when he had a perfect answer. He learned to let others be wrong without needing to correct them. He discovered that by not reacting, he was gaining a level of control he had never known. He was becoming a mountain, unmoved by the wind, yet dictating the path of everything that tried to climb it. After 3 years of absolute stillness, the abbot of the monastery called Julian to the inner sanctum. This was the first time Julian had entered the heart of the mountain. The air was thin, scented with ancient incense and the cold smell of stone. The abbot looked at Julian, not with judgment, but with a gaze that seemed to pierce through his very skin. "You have learned to be quiet," the abbot said, his voice sounding like the grinding of tectonic plates. "But you have not yet learned the power of the unspoken. Silence is not just the absence of sound, it is the accumulation of energy. Every word you do not say becomes a stone in your foundation. Every reaction you suppress becomes a spark in your furnace." Julian spent the next year learning the art of the void. He was taught that most people are like leaking buckets, they dissipate their power through constant complaining, bragging, and explaining. When you encounter an insult and you do not retaliate, that energy does not disappear, it stays within you, transforming into a cold, calculated strength. He learned to observe the vibrations of a room. He practiced standing in a crowded space and remaining so still, so mentally silent, that people would begin to feel an unexplainable pressure in his presence. It was the weight of a man who had mastered his internal chaos. He was no longer a victim of his environment, he was the anchor of it. The abbot gave him one final task before his departure, the trial of the mirror. Julian was placed in a room with a man who was instructed to provoke him by any means necessary. For 3 days, this man insulted Julian's family, mocked his failures, and spat on his shadow. In his old life, Julian would have broken the man's jaw in seconds. But now, he simply sat. He watched the man's face redden, watched his veins bulge, and watched his energy drain away. By the 3rd day, the provoker fell to his knees, weeping. Julian's silence had acted as a mirror, forcing the man to see his own ugliness so clearly that he could no longer sustain his rage. Julian realized then that silence isn't just a shield, it is a surgical tool that can dismantle an opponent without ever drawing blood. Julian returned to the city not as a ghost, but as a force of nature. He didn't wear expensive suits or carry gold watches anymore. He wore simple, dark clothing and carried an aura of absolute certainty. He walked into the lion's den, the very boardroom where his empire had been stolen. His former partner, Marcus, was leading a meeting, surrounded by the same people who had once cheered for Julian's downfall. When Julian entered, the room didn't erupt in noise, it fell into a jagged, uncomfortable hush. He didn't announce his presence. He didn't demand his seat back. He simply walked to the far end of the table and stood there, looking at Marcus with a calm, unblinking gaze. Marcus, sensing the shift in the room's gravity, began to talk. He tried to laugh it off, making jokes about Julian's spiritual retreat and his homeless appearance. Julian said nothing. He didn't smile, he didn't frown, he just remained a pillar of stillness. The silence began to eat at Marcus. He started explaining the company's new direction, justifying the betrayal, and listing his recent successes. The more he talked, the more he looked like a child trying to convince a parent of a lie. The investors in the room began to shift in their seats. They looked from the sweating, rambling Marcus to the rock-solid, silent Julian. They realized that the man talking was terrified, and the man standing still was in total control. Without saying a single word, Julian had shifted the power dynamic of the entire corporation. One by one, the board members stood up and walked toward Julian. They didn't need a speech. They didn't need promises. They were drawn to the stability that Julian radiated in a world of frantic change. Marcus screamed, he threatened lawsuits, he threw papers into the air, but his noise was now nothing more than the buzzing of an insect. Julian finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying the resonance of the mountain. You have spent 3 years building a house of cards with your mouth. I have spent 3 years building a mountain with my silence. The wind is here, Marcus. And you have nowhere to hide. Julian did not become a CEO again in the traditional sense. He became something much more powerful, an architect of influence. He moved through the 2026 landscape like a shadow, making deals that shifted global markets through quiet conversations and strategic pauses. He taught a new generation of leaders that in an era of digital overstimulation, the rarest and most valuable commodity is focused attention. He built an empire not on the noise of marketing, but on the silence of quality. People began to seek him out, traveling from all over the world just to sit in his presence for a few minutes, hoping to catch a glimpse of the peace he had found in the ice. He lived his life by a new set of laws. He never defended himself against rumors, knowing that time is the best investigator. He never boasted of his victories, knowing that true success speaks for itself. He realized that the greatest trap of the modern man is the need to be understood. When you stop trying to explain yourself, you reclaim the energy you used to waste on people who were never going to listen anyway. Julian was finally free. He had mastered the ultimate paradox, that to be truly heard, you must first learn to be silent. And to be truly powerful, you must first learn to be nothing. If you are listening to this right now, feeling the weight of a world that never stops talking, take a breath. Look at the gurulta surrounding you, the social media feeds, the endless opinions, the pressure to be someone. Ask yourself, what would happen if you just stopped? What if you let the world be wrong about you? What if you built your strength in the dark, away from the flickering lights of public approval? Remember Julian. Remember the mountain. Your silence is not a void, it is a reservoir of untapped power. In the end, the loudest shouts will be forgotten, but the man who mastered the silence will be the one who moves the world. The journey into the quiet starts the moment you decide that your own opinion of yourself is the only one that matters. Welcome to the era of the silent king.